Hope everyone had a good break. We will resume now the Central Region Seasonal Symposium. Next up, we have Shannon White, who will be speaking to the hazard services.
Well, hello, everyone. Let me go ahead and share my presentation here. Okay, so what we're going to talk about here is just a few hazard services winter best practices. Just a quick reminder about the turnkey changes. I know Jess from AFS is going to get into a lot more detail about this, so it's just mostly kind of a cursory reminder of what changes were made. But the bulk of this is going to be about long fuse workflow best practices. So how can you approach the hazard services long fuse, especially with winter, and try to make things as easy as possible for yourself and the forecasters in the office? And to that effect, just reminding everyone of some available resources to help with that. So just for those turnkey changes that we went through here at the first of the month, those wind chill VTEC, the WC hazards no longer exist. So they don't exist anywhere, and of course, obviously, they don't exist in the winter products. And they've been replaced with the existing extreme cold, both watch and warning, and a new cold weather advisory. But all of these hazards are now in the NPW. So whereas before, maybe you kind of would put everything into the WSW where you had a big event, and on the backside in particular, there's some really cold temperatures. You'll have the WSW for your snowfall information, and then now the NPW for that cold, the dangerous cold information. As part of this, I just kind of threw it in there. The hard freeze also doesn't exist anymore. All of that is kind of covered within the existing freeze hazards. And if you have like those temperatures that would trigger the hard freeze, you can do that through special wording that will get triggered. And also, just as a reminder, we had the turnkey that everyone did, but there have been some issues that were noted post-turnkey, and those were handled through a patch from the hazard services folks for your hazard services. And then all that is going to be codified in the upcoming 2322 build, which is in beta right now at a few select offices and should be coming out at the beginning of about December. Now, we all know there have been some things brought up about NWR waves not handling the cold weather advisory, NWR waves and BMH, and also Graphy DSS. And Central Processing is working on some instructions for both of those things on how to make changes locally so that all the applications across AWIPS will properly handle these changes. So they are working on that, and hopefully information will be coming very soon. And I believe some thanks went to a couple of Central Region folks for actually developing the instructions for NWR waves. So thank you very much for that. Okay, so now on to best practices. But first, we kind of want to clear the air. And that is, we know that long fused has turned out to be a challenge. And there's just no getting around it. And while it was a challenge this past summer with all the heat that we had, winter is probably going to be even more difficult, honestly. I don't want to sugarcoat it. The long fuse workflow in hazard services is absolutely the biggest change to how you approach hazard generation of any of the hazard types. So, we had we had the hydro, which, warn gen and hazard services function very similarly. People really hated River Pro to begin with, so a change there was not a huge deal. And flood watches, you don't have as much permutation to those to have brought out a lot of these challenges before now. So this is really the biggest change to how you approach the hazard generation. And that's in large part because of how many permutations there are possible with these long fuse hazards. You can expand them, you can change them in time. The ETNs kind of link together, those tracking numbers link together, and like how all that works and how it all plays together really makes it very complex. But mostly it's because we're trying to change the philosophy. And that is, hazard services is structured so that down the road, we're able to actually do polygons for all hazards. We're not there yet. We're really not terribly close yet, but we're trying to get there as an agency. There are milestones and things in the works to try to get us there. But in order to have the infrastructure in place to support it so that you aren't having to completely relearn everything once again, once we get to that point, the infrastructure has been put in place so that hazard services is tracking things individually, and it has all of this data that it has contained within those hazard events. It has area, time, metadata information that you select in the hazard information dialog. All this stuff is stored within those, whereas GFE is just super simple grids. There's nothing terribly complex about that. So it's really similar to the change in philosophy. Those of us who, like myself, are old enough to remember back to the days when you actually hand typed forecasts. It's similar to the transition we made back then about 20 years ago from hand typing your forecast to actually creating grids from which the forecast now falls out. And so it's similar in change to philosophy, from that transition. And I think it's also not a secret that for the most part, we're not super great in this agency at culture change and how to prepare everyone for culture change. And so it's just been, this has been a much more challenging transition for these hazard types, the NPW and the WSW, than I think was anticipated. So just like with most things, repetition will help. Getting the muscle memory for hazard services and how it behaves is going to really help things. But these first few seasons are probably going to be a bit of a struggle. So just try to be patient with yourselves and try to maybe use practice mode as much as possible to get the repetition, to get familiar with how things operate. And don't hesitate to open tickets. If you're like, you know what, this just doesn't make sense. It shouldn't behave this way. It never hurts to open a ticket and see if we can make changes in the hazard services itself to address some of those things. But also keeping in mind that maybe it's structured this way because we're trying to make sure that these hazard events are kind of standalone information that down the road would be able to be its own product. So I hope that kind of helps with the bigger picture, but it does make the transition a lot more challenging. So to that effect, what are some tips and best practices to help make this transition a success? The first is always think of when you're creating a new hazard event or modifying an existing hazard event. Let's say you have a snow a winter weather advisory for snowfall in one area and a winter storm warning for heavier snow, for larger snowfall amounts in another area, but things are changing so that you're having to kind of swap some zones between the two. Always, always, always approach it that you remove any areas, right now it's zones, from an existing hazard event first. That is your first step. And you do that through the right mouse click before you add them to another hazard event. So you have to think of it as I have to kind of clean up first before moving on to the next thing. Whereas it's kind of habit to just, let's make the new thing and then I clean up afterwards. And that's just not how hazard services works. And it just showed time and time again over the summer with the extreme heat that we had, that people get into a bad state very easily by trying to create the new thing first and then backwards, clean up stuff afterwards. So always your first step is, okay, if I'm changing zones A, B, and C to be from one thing to another, I need to remove A, B, and C first from where they are before adding them to the new hazard event. Also, kind of like with, make hazard, merge hazard, when you would get a warning that maybe you have overlapping hazards, just like you don't ignore that, hopefully, never ignore a red X on the hazard information dialog. So like in this case, what I was talking about before with removing zones first is that, let's say you don't do that and you leave them in there and you just put them into the new hazard event And when you click propose, you'll immediately see you get a red X in the tab for the hazard event dialog, the hazard information dialog. And that's letting you know, hey, this is in conflict with something else. And so never ignore those. And if you did happen to ignore those and go on to create a product, you'll get another banner saying, hey, this is in conflict with another hazard. So please just never ignore those. And another way to kind of get this before you get all the way to the product generation step is that propose step. It's good for a lot of reasons. Obviously it shares that hazard information to the GFE forecast database, which then shares it out through ISC. And so while maybe your neighboring sites don't have you in their console as a visible site, they can at least see it in the grids in ISC mode. So that's helpful from a collaboration standpoint, but it also gives you that feedback through the hazard information dialog, giving you a red X if there's a problem. So it's just a good practice to get into, especially for the long views, because it gives you that feedback a little bit sooner. And then if you do encounter issues, let's say you're just like, okay, I got red X's all over the place. I can't generate a product. I don't even know what to do. It's honestly, especially since these are longer views and there's not quite the time crunch, it's like I have to get out the door right this second. It's rather than trying to figure out how to fix what you've done, it's just better to revert to last issued and maybe going back to some of your crutches, either the job sheets or local aids or something like that to get you through the process, especially if it's one of these more complex things. And going along with that, if you've maybe made new events, that are just in pending state, deleting those so that you're completely back to where you were before you tried starting to make edits, going back to that last issued and following, some steps somewhere rather than going by memory, to just, until we get comfortable with this process, making sure you're taking the right steps at the right time to do what you need to do. So those are really some of the core of the best practices. But a few more, because this is something that throws me every time I go in and I'm like, oh, right. If I'm making a new event, you're left clicking to add, and it, highlights the zone in that color if you're using select by using the map selection. But if you have an existing hazard and you're wanting to add zones to it, you use the right mouse button. And I know it's kind of hard to see because I have it on a black background, but it's hatching these new areas here that I'm adding to an existing hazard event. So left click if it's brand new, but right click if you're adding to an existing. And that's a small detail, but it can really throw you if you're making new events and modifying existing events all throughout one process. And that, I think, is going to be relatively common in winter. So just another tip I added more recently as I was kind of updating some job sheets and doing things. I'm like, this always throws me. I'm guessing it'll probably throw other people too. Just a couple of other things. This one is going to be a challenge, and it's a little bit easier in heat where you're, maybe, can stretch it out over longer periods of time, but with snow and other winter hazards, it's going to be more of a challenge. But as much as possible, trying not to make more hazard events than are truly needed. It can be difficult to manage through your console, what hazard events are for where and everything, and just trying to keep it all up to date. It can be a little confusing, but it just makes things more complex. So trying to keep it as simple as possible while still making sure that the amounts that are going into your final product reflect what you want the public to know. So it is going to be a delicate balance, and maybe testing a few things out, going after a few events, kind of getting into a rhythm of, okay, what's critical versus balancing that simplicity with the detail you want to convey to the public and decision makers. So that's going to be a delicate balance to strike, and trying to through trial and error and just getting repetition of seeing maybe what are some of the the best ways to accomplish that locally. Now, again, if you do have multiple events, let's say you start out and you're, kind of slicing and dicing the snowfall amounts a little bit more. And then later on, you're like, you know what, it's kind of turned out to be pretty, consistent across the whole area. You can easily, as long as it's the same hazard type and the time range, you can combine those events later and, simplify your console and simplify your product. So there's that combined hazards tool that you can use to later on, combine hazard events that maybe earlier in the event you had separated out. And that's definitely recommended to kind of, streamline things as you move through an event. And this is something that we're seeing more and more, especially now that we're having some events out in the Intermountain West. Just a reminder that hazard services and GFE cannot be used interchangeably. If it's just a regular old update and there's no changes, chances are you can get away with it. Okay, it's starting out in hazard services and doing an update in GFE. But if you make any kind of changes in GFE to time, to area, hazard services can't really see that because it's storing its data based on, complex geometries that it's reading from what you do in hazard services. And GFE just, when it's doing the interoperability and creating those events from GFE, it's just reading VTech. There's no way for it to know where that really is. So they really cannot be used interchangeably. And to that effect, big shout out to Phil Karimsky from Green Bay. We actually just had a call right before this, and I added some slides because when we were talking about this issue, he was like, it would be nice if GFE would just kind of remind people, because it's 3 a.m. and you're like, okay, I need to do something, and you just fall back to what you're accustomed to, which is GFE. And he's like, it would be nice if GFE would be like, hey, go use hazard services. So we talked about it, and we can change, make changes to GFE so that it says, hey, just a reminder, use hazard services. And I just mocked it up super quick before this presentation here and added it. And you can see where it says, winter weather, use hazard services. And the same over on the formatter launcher. Let's say you didn't have to actually make changes, through make hazard, so you wouldn't have seen that. But then you go to run the formatter, it says, hey, use hazard services. I'm going to bring this up on a call with the regional AWEP's focal points later this afternoon and see if they're all on board with this. I'll write up some instructions. Okay, good. I like seeing that people think this is a good idea, because I mean, we're just, if you're in the habit of using GFE, and especially on a midnight shift, I mean, you're just going to be like, I use GFE, this is what I do. And just having that kind of visual reminder, go use hazard services. I need to launch hazard services. Let me see, what's that question? That includes, so yes, that's actually the next part. Thank you. Is just a reminder of what is available from a forecaster standpoint. And that is, it's pretty much all contained within the Hazard Services VLab site. This VLab site is a wealth of information, and I realized I meant to link the VLab site in the slides. I will do that so that you actually can click on it and go to it. But I'll do that after this. But there's a really comprehensive VLab site that includes all the hazards. So everything back from hydro, both, aerial and point-based, to the MPW and WSW, and soon we'll include the convective information that is being tested at a select few sites, including St. Louis. So we do have, lots of information on this site for both forecasters and focal points. So I'm just going to touch on kind of some of the things that is included in this site. Okay. So we have forecaster and focal point. If you click on the focal point, it actually has the different hazard types. And for winter, The first thing that you see is this interactive, there's an image, and if you click on it, it brings up what's called an interactive file mapper. So it has different pages for like different parts that you might want to change. I just picked the first one here, which is, let's say you want to change what shows up in the hazard information dialog. It, gives you an idea of where you would make those changes, including links to job sheets on how to make those changes. So Jim Raymer has an absolutely fantastic focal point guide, which is truly exhaustive for all the different things you might want to do. But it's long, and it can be a little bit challenging to maybe find the information you need. This just kind of takes you to, this is how you do this specific thing. And so you have the HID, you have it has the, let me look at it again here. It has the HID, the, different parts of the product, like how you would change, what people see for, for the what, where, like how you would change that output, the impacts and CTAs, how you would change that output, how you do things like we just had a big thread on the hazard services info list about how to remove the including the cities of. That's in there, how you can add special links to, things in your office, how to do the commute phrases, all that kind of stuff is in here. And so that's for focal points. And then there's also a list of job sheets. So if you don't go through the images, it actually has a list of the available job sheets, but the job sheets are linkable. They're clickable in the actual images. So you have both ways of going about things there. Now for forecasters, it's just a list of job sheets, but it kind of takes you through from the really basic to the more complex. And the ones here in the middle are the ones that really are, like creating multiple hazards at once, changing stuff, like those kind of guys here. That was really terrible. But those are the ones that really kind of get you into the very the more complex kind of actions that you might have to take of swapping things back and forth, zones and making area and time changes at once, and where it's very important to follow the order of operations. So those are, I'm guessing, going to be the ones that are the most useful. If there's something missing, and I realize in the list it doesn't have the new one, the super complex one that was added. I guess I forgot to add it to the list. There is a job sheet for that, so I will fix that on the VLab site here later. But those are the ones where it's probably good for the first few events to make sure you're following the steps in the right order until everyone gets comfortable with how to do things in hazard services. And hopefully by next, the next time we're doing stuff in the summer, if there's maybe complex wind or heat events, but definitely again by next winter, just hopefully people start to get into the swing of things. But for this winter, I really do recommend when you're doing any kind of complex actions to follow the job sheets to start with here, so that you're making sure you're doing things in the right order and not getting into a bad state. So that is actually all I have. And I saw there was something that came up, but it was something about like local. Okay. And it seems like a lot of people have done this. Just making sure that it does have the right order of operations, because that's very, very important for these more complex actions. But I have had the request to take the job sheets and for these more complex things, maybe like remove the pictures so that it's more condensed and is easier to follow, because it's really just more of, okay, I need a reminder. It's not like the first time I'm going through it. I just need a refresher. So having like two versions, one that's the very detailed and maybe more guidelines. It's just, I'm actually on detail to GSL for a year, doing, helping them with like developing regression tests and other things like that, and not so much in training right now, but there's a lot of overlap between these things. So that's on the kind of back burner for now, making those kind of simplified job sheets, I guess I'll call them.
Thank you, Shannon. We still have a few minutes for questions if anyone has any. So feel free to raise your hand or enter them in the chat.
And if you do, I really do ask, if you come up with a scenario that you're just like, I don't even know, like what we were supposed to do here. We did get a lot of those, or several of them, and many of them were the same scenario during all the excessive heat we had this summer. And having those passed on, like we had one from Fort Worth, and it turns out what they were trying to do, we had a bug, and it wouldn't allow it, flat out wouldn't allow them. It wasn't that they were doing something wrong. There was a bug in the system, and it's fixed in 2322. So we need to know these. So if you come across, a scenario that you're just like, we follow the job sheets, or it wasn't covered in the job sheets, please pass that on, and we can take a look at it and either put it together a set of instructions that this is how you do this for the future, or maybe we find a bug and something that we have to fix, but we can't fix it if we don't know about it. So please pass on any, struggles that you come across.
Very good reminder to relay feedback. Also, I appreciate that you provided some great tips and best practices. All right, we did get one question from Lance. Is it possible to have hazard services default to zones in the maps drop down for long fused?
So that is driven by what you have loaded in GFE. So, and I kind of have that. I mean, I have that in the focal point stuff, but because it's actually driven by what you have in GFE, we have noticed, especially in Central Region, where oftentimes the zones and the counties match. So why would you load both maps? That doesn't make any sense. Whereas, in the more mountainous areas, I mean, like Boulder obviously loads, the zones because they're very different from counties, but that's not the case in a big stretch of the country. So making sure in GFE you have forecast zones as one of your maps that loads in your site level GFE config file, then it shows up by default, and it's not something you have to load to make it appear. Now, as for making it the default, I will have to go back. Let me write this down. I'll have to go back and look as to what order it appears at when you do the select by maps. Is it tied to the order that they're loaded in GFE, or is it something else? That I will have to look into because I'm not sure.
Okay, yeah, Lance noted, yes, specifically asking about making it the default.
Okay, I will take a look at that.
Great. We appreciate you looking into that.
Any other?
All right. Well, not seeing any other questions or comments. So thank you again, Shannon, for joining us today and speaking on hazard services for winter.